Welcome to our second lecture in the lecture series that Maria Huang and I are organizing, Emerging Feminist Research on Asia. This is going to be the last lecture for the semester, but next academic year we have 5 more, ranging from anthropology, sociology, and history, and featuring Japan, work done on Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, and China. And we're very, very happy today to introduce Professor Clara Iwasaki from the Department of East Asian Studies at University of Alberta. And as you know, and as our website tells, the idea of this speaker series is to introduce very recent works. That's why it's called Emerging Research. And we have invited speakers who have recently published or are just about to publish monographs which examine Asian history, culture, migration, and peoples from a feminist lens and a feminist perspective. So I'm very happy today to introduce Clara Iwasaki, who will talk about her book, Rethinking the Modern Chinese Canon, Refractions Across the Transpacific, which came out with Cambria Press in 2020, the end of 2020, so very, very recent. We're very happy to have you, Clara. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? All right, thanks so much for all the thumbs up. So I first really want to thank Professor Huang and Professor Gavili for inviting me, and thank you, all of you, for coming out on a rainy Thursday at the very end of the term. So I'm really honored to have you come and listen to this. Hopefully it will not be too boring. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a couple different figures who are up here, and I'll be talking about Xiao Hong, Agnes Smedley, Upton Sinclair, and Helen Foster Snow. So I'll begin with this particular letter, and this is a letter that was published in the Hong Kong newspaper Shidai Wenxue on September 1st, 1941. And this is a letter, which you can see up here, from Upton Sinclair, the American leftist writer, to Xiao Hong. And the letter's really brief, and it reads, Dear Miss, and he spelled her name wrong, Miss Xiao Hong, Hong Kong, China, Dear Miss Hong, I received the beautiful gift which Agnes Smedley brought to me with your greetings. I accept the gift and wish to thank you for your kind thought in sending it. I am sending you a copy of my book Co-op, thinking that you might be interested in making use of this novel. I've also attached some of my recent pamphlets. So I begin my talk with this question, right? Why was an American writer exchanging letters and manuscripts with a Chinese writer in Hong Kong in 1941? Despite the fact that Xiao Hong and Upton Sinclair are both well-known writers in their own countries, their association with one another has remained almost completely untalked about. But the existence of this letter is evidence of the possibilities of the Transpacific connection between American and Chinese leftists, even if this potential was not fully realized in this case, because shortly after he writes this letter, Xiao Hong dies in Hong Kong. So the advent of the Cold War following Japan's surrender meant that American and Chinese writers found it much more difficult to facilitate open exchanges like these for several decades. And the literary meeting of these two iconic writers of Chinese and American literature, it's a moment that hints at a professional friendship that might have been. And so, here are the kind of two writers I've talked about. They'll reappear in a little bit. I'd like to sort of briefly introduce the person on the left, Agnes Smedley, who I think is a little bit less well known. She's also an American leftist writer, but she's remained relatively understudied, in part because the majority of her career is really written about China. The person on the right is Helen Foster Snow, who I'll introduce in a little bit, but these are the kind of 4 subjects of my talk. So Agnes Smedley came to know Xiao Hong and came to facilitate this exchange between Upton Sinclair and Xiao Hong because she was friends with a writer you may be familiar with, Lu Xun, who's sort of the great father of modern Chinese literature. So Smedley met Lu Xun in Shanghai, and he kind of helped her gain entree into Chinese literary circles. Smedley spoke no Chinese when they met in Shanghai, and Lucian spoke no English. So they really communicated in the one language that they had in common, which was German. Smedley, I won't talk about this too much, is just a really interesting figure who gets involved in a lot of really interesting movements. So prior to arriving in Shanghai, she actually traveled overland from Germany, where she had been involved in the Indian independence movement. And before that, she had been involved in the kind of contraceptive movement and knew Margaret Sanger in the United States. So she's a really fascinating figure. She's kind of always in the middle or on the periphery of these kind of different world historical moments. And I hope her work will continue to be explored by other people. So during this time, Smedley is introduced to Xiaohong, and Xiaohong recollects their meeting in 1936 in the following passage, right? Smedley, this is my translation. Agnes Smedley was already an acquaintance. I had met her 2 years ago in Shanghai. She wore a leather jacket. She was a bit fat. Actually, she wasn't fat, but she was a big person. She had a laugh that would peel out, and when she laughed too hard, tears would well up in her eyes. She was an American, which is an interesting description. Okay, so Smedley eventually becomes proficient in Chinese, and she's in fact able to contribute to the translation of her own novel, Daughter of the Earth, which is translated into Chinese as Da Di de Nuer in 1937. And this is a work that was pretty well known at the time of its publication, but has really kind of fallen out of, it is not part of the American literary canon. It's not really part of the world literary canon in any way now. But the translation was widely read and highly regarded in leftist Chinese circles. And so the novel's translation into Chinese makes it available to Xiaohong, who, unlike other sort of disgustingly multilingual May 4th writers, basically, she spoke Chinese very well, she wrote it very well, but she was not, kind of as polyglot as other writers. This allows her to kind of read it, and she records her experience reading the novel in an essay titled Da Di de Nuer yu Dongluan Shi Dai, Daughter of the Earth and Restless Days, which is, and I say this with a lot of affection, a very strange essay. It's so weird. It's so interesting. So as the title indicates, this is supposed to be sort of a book review, or supposed to be some kind of mediation on two novels, Smedley's novel and Lilo Linke's Restless Days, which is another novel that I won't talk about here. But it's in fact kind of a really stream of conscious mediation of a number of sort of thoughts that she has that's sort of in a constellation around reading this book. So Xiaohong begins the piece by saying she wanted to write down her thoughts on both Daughter of the Earth and Restless Days, but kept putting it off. However, she finally started to get around to it when she found herself trapped inside Shanghai's foreign concession as wartime hostilities mounted. So during this time, she says she'd been reading a lot of Western literary works like the Odyssey and some works on Western literary history. And so she goes on to describe a few brief scenes from Restless Days before moving on to Daughter of the Earth. She offers some brief praise of the book's artistic qualities, but kind of swiftly moves on to discussing an incident in her own life in which two unnamed male friends of hers talk to her about the novel. And it's very interesting, right? So this again is my own translation, but is this one of your girly books? Let me see, where is it? Although that isn't how they said it, that was what they meant. The other one was also acting wild, his slender fingertips pointed at the cover. What's this, Restless Days? Is this woman writer two horses? Even though he was laughing, it wasn't out of mirth. Daughter of the Earth, I see, she's not wearing clothes, look at her. So Xiaohong doesn't name either man, but she records in this very sort of dispassionate way how these two male friends of hers dismiss the two novels as women's books and mock them without looking further than the cover art. And so the content of Daughter of the Earth is never taken into account. The only thing that seems to interest these two friends of hers is that the woman on the cover is nude. So she doesn't criticize them directly, but her presentation of their comments reflects the easy way and the kind of thoughtless way in which they dismiss the two books. And so she asked this really pointed question after talking about how this second man was laughing, where she says, was he laughing because he was happy? She doesn't answer that question, but she raises it, and I find that sort of interesting. So she abruptly shifts from this moment to a moment in time when she saw a crippled male beggar on her way back from buying groceries in the foreign concession. And she says, I loathe fighting, I loathe broken arms and broken legs, but when I saw a man sleeping like a pig by the base of the wall, I didn't fear him at all. So from there, she turns to discussing her thoughts on the two books with a group of female students, reminding the writer of this conceptual leap that she's taken in her encounter with this old beggar. So she talks about, kind of discussing the story, and she really zeroes in on a really key moment in Smedley's novel. Smedley's novel is a sort of autobiographical story of a character that seems to resemble the author very closely. And the moment that Xiaohong is really interested in is a moment where the main character's mother, who has no clothes to wear, she doesn't have any clothing that doesn't have holes in it, and her husband buys her some cloth to make a dress, but he feels that she is not grateful enough. And so he starts to berate her and sort of bully her and threaten her. And so it's this moment that she kind of continues to return to in this essay. So she says, if that old man is obviously a person and not a pig, right? So she has had this encounter with a beggar, and she's like, he's sleeping like a pig, but I know he's not a pig, right? I feel like he is a person. I know that this man is a person. How can one make sense? Why must he sleep at the base of a wall? How can one make sense of this? If a woman is obviously a person, why must she be made to cry when she is given a piece of cloth, right? And this is the way that Xiaohong often asks questions. Right? So in this comparison, Xiaohong highlights the unequal application of sympathy. She, as a woman, can recognize the beggar man as a human. But the father in Daughter of the Earth is unable to recognize his own wife as a fellow human being. So she then returns to the two men who made fun of the novels that she was reading. This is why I really love this essay, but it's so weird. She says, I believe that the knight's mockery wasn't in earnest, because they are intellectuals and support a modern society. They aren't hidebound conservatives. But if that was the case, and they were just having a bit of fun on a lively occasion when everyone is affected by youthful high spirits and talking and laughing freely, why do men unerringly single women out to be the butt of their jokes? She doesn't answer that question either. So Xiaohong here, I think, is indicating her awareness of the double standard that exists in this Shanghai intellectual circle, which is a very leftist circle, and as she says, possibly not entirely sincerely, a very progressive circle, right? These are people who believe that they are, committed to gender equality and societal reform, right? In this passage, she indirectly acknowledges the added vulnerability of women, even foreign female authors. So her essay barely touches on the plots of these novels, and so if she was intending to write a book review, it's probably not a good one. But at the end, this essay kind of adds up to asserting the importance of telling women's stories. While not openly condemning the comments of the men, Xiaohong's account of their dismissal of the two books that resonated so strongly with her indicates the deficiency she perceives in male empathy. So while she doesn't engage directly with the texts themselves, right, certain images and themes in the novel continue to resonate in Xiaohong's thoughts as she relates these concepts to her own experiences. The brutal scenario of the father in Daughter of the Earth, making his wife beg for cloth to clothe herself, is used to punctuate her description of her male friend's casual denigration and dismissal of female authors. In addition, the juxtaposition of Xiaohong's own encounter with the beggar mirrors Smedley's depiction of an abject woman who's being forced to beg. So she makes this case that a desire for alterity between genders seems only to be possible for women and not for men. Xiaohong's emphasis on this empathetic imagination, particular to women, is an important part of her famous short story show, or Hands. Although she problematizes it, I think, to a pretty significant degree. So the story, if you're not familiar with it, describes the classist persecution of a dyer's daughter, a woman who her family dyes clothing for a living, Wang Yaming, who her father, with considerable sacrifice, has been able to send to a middle-class girls' school, a middle school. And Ya-Ming, although she's entered the school, is continually bullied and shunned by teachers and fellow students. And this bullying kind of begins from the difference between their hands and her hands. Her hands have a really dark stain because she dyes clothing blue or black. And so her hands stand in for the many ways in which she finds it difficult to kind of fit in with her wealthier peers. And the narrator goes on to kind of point out other things, the grotesque way she speaks English, her difficulty in writing and arithmetic, things like that. She eventually contracts tuberculosis after having to sleep in a dark hallway in the dormitory because none of the other girls is willing to share a bed with her. And the story is told from the perspective of another girl at the school who sympathizes with Ya-Ming up to a point, but observes the persecution she endures without doing anything. The only action that the narrator takes is to lend her a copy of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. And so, this is a passage from the story. There was a Sunday when the dorm was bright and empty. I was reading The Jungle loudly to myself. I was at the point when the female worker, Maria, fainted in the snow. I was looking out at the snow and reading aloud. I felt it was all very moving. Wang Ya-Ming was standing behind me, but I had no idea she was there. So Xiaohong depicts the narrator's self-important reading out loud to herself. And while she is moved by the plight of this female character, she remains really oblivious to Ya-Ming, who is in many ways a Maria of her own life. Ya-Ming asks to borrow the book, and like the narrator, she also finds this character's plight quite moving, but her reaction and Xiaohong's depiction of it is completely different. Maria, it seems like this character really existed, this person really existed. She fell over into the snow. I don't think she's dead. She couldn't be dead. That doctor knew she didn't have any money and wouldn't see her. Har, har, she laughs shrilly. Then she rocked forward with laughter, tears spilled from her eyes. I asked a doctor to come once when my mother was ill. And she goes on in the story to kind of describe this parallel situation which led to the death of her mother. Her mother is refused medical care because the doctor finds out what the family's profession is and says, well, you don't have enough, you can't afford me, right? I'm not coming out. So the narrator and Ya-Ming both reference the same moment in the jungle, right? They both resonate around this kind of same moment. While Xiaohong's depiction of the narrator's emotion is described by the trite phrase, I felt it was all very moving, Ya-Ming has a kind of passionate engagement with the text to the point of shedding tears. And it shows us that she's really moved, right? We see her be moved rather than the narrator telling us that she is moved. Her impassioned insistence that Maria is not dead and that the character is real emphasize the depth and fervor of her connection. So like Xiaohong's own experience reading Daughter of the Earth, Ya-Ming turns almost immediately from her experience of reading the novel to how it resonates with her own experience, right? There's this kind of similar turn where you read something and then it immediately kind of brings up something in your own life. Maria's unsuccessful attempt to see a doctor mirrors her own attempt to bring a doctor to see her own mother as she lies ill at home. So Xiaohong clearly demonstrates the revolutionary potential of reading. Right? A dyer's daughter in Manchuria can see her own life reflected in a Polish immigrant in the United States. Xiaohong bridges the distance and differences between these characters through the act of Ya-Ming's reading. After months of alienation and persecution, it is in that moment that Ya-Ming recognizes something relevant to her own life. So it's also the only time in the story that the reader sees Ya-Ming's past life or subjectivity in any detail. The rest of the narrator's account of her is focused on her awkwardness, her mistakes, her crude mannerisms. And so inspired by reading The Jungle, the reader can see her for the first time without the alienating awkwardness observed by the narrator, but really as a character with her own story. So Xiaohong's depiction of reading the works of this American leftist writer, Upton Sinclair, and I assume it's not said in the letter, right? But I have assumed that the kind of impetus for Upton Sinclair writing the thank you note is in fact because he found out about this, reference to his own work, reveals the imaginative potential of proletarian fiction. The effect of this phenomenon is to create a shared readership among the marginalized. It's also clear that living in Shanghai had introduced Xiaohong to works of writers that she had the opportunity to meet, like Agnes Smedley, and to works of writers whom she would never meet but influenced her greatly nevertheless, like Upton Sinclair. While not the most visible or most significant literary influences that Xiaohong had in her short career, her connection to the American leftist literary scene suggests her career was more transnational than originally thought. If you're familiar with Xiaohong, which you may or may not be, I'm going to just make a wild supposition and say you may be familiar with her from the Columbia University Anthology of Modern Chinese Literature, right? She's very kind of squarely placed within, Chinese literature, period, right? But I hope to suggest, right, that even though, right, she herself did not move that many places, although she did move around quite a bit, there are ways that we can still read her transpacifically, right? Okay. So let's see. So Xiaohong refracted Smedley and Sinclair through her own fiction, but the acts of refraction cut both ways, and her work also moved into the American leftist literary scene of the time. So Smedley doesn't actually mention ever meeting Xiaohong in her accounts of her life in Shanghai, but she does briefly mention her at the end of her book, Battle Hymn of China, when the two are reunited in Hong Kong. And so she describes her thus, right? In a new Chinese womanhood, in many ways, far in advance of American womanhood, was being forged in the fierce anvil of war. One such woman lived with me for a time in Bishop Hall's country home. Her name was Xiaohong, and her fate was typical. So Smedley, in the rest of the passage, goes on to compare Xiaohong favorably to Madame Chiang Kai-shek, Song Meiling, perhaps the most well-known Chinese woman in the United States at the time, who was also living in Hong Kong. And this is, I believe, I can't remember the dates on this. I believe Battle Hymn of China comes out in like 1940, 1941, something like that. So she goes on to discuss the three famous Song sisters, of whom Madame Jiang is one. I often wondered what would have happened to the whole Song family if they had been born in obscurity and poverty that bound most of the Chinese doing duty in the war zones. So in this passage, Smedley makes the very sharp and critical observation that the fame and acclaim that the Song sisters enjoy is a result of their lack of being born into their luck in being born into a wealthy and powerful family. Song Meiling married Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jieshi, and her sister married Sun Zhongshan, and the other one married a very rich man whose name I can't remember at the moment. So they're sort of famous in that way. If they had been born into, rather than their individual brilliance or their strength of character, if they had been born into different circumstances, she suggests their lot may have been as unfortunate as that of Xiaohong. So Xiaohong is really presented here as a counterpoint to the political and economic elite of China. And she's presented as emblematic of a new generation of Chinese women, forged by the revolution, and an example of the oppressed proletariat of China. This, in and of itself, is somewhat problematic. I don't think that Xiaohong would have necessarily said she was like a member of the proletariat. She had a privileged existence in many ways. So while Xiaohong sees encounters of American literature as an opportunity to contemplate the universality of human experience, Smedley uses Xiaohong as a counterexample to the kind of nationalist elite of China, encouraging the American reading public to look more closely for real Chinese heroism than this kind of elite class. In her indication to read Xiaohong's life as a national allegory, Smedley remains somewhat unusual among her American compatriots because she explicitly characterizes Chinese feminism as more advanced than the American movement in the United States. Although, let's see, where am I? Okay, so that said, other American leftists were also interested in demonstrating the close relationship between China and the United States, but they often characterized their friends as being sort of, the way that they represented their Chinese friends were often sort of implicated by paternalistic and Orientalist stereotypes. Smedley's work successfully, I think, in my opinion, avoids these tropes for the most part. But despite her efforts, many of her friends, including Upton Sinclair, could not resist casting Smedley herself as the white savior of the Chinese. So this is from an essay that Upton Sinclair wrote about Agnes Smedley herself. And he says, if anyone had told me that 21 years later, he recalls previously in the essay having met Smedley while she was in the United States and was involved in kind of leftist politics, that 21 years later, she would be leading an army of celestial revolutionaries. That did not happen. I should have been much surprised, and so no doubt would she. How does it happen that a child born of old American parentage and living in Missouri, in Colorado, Iowa, California, New York, and in fact most of the states of the Union, become a partisan of races with skins darker than her own? Why does she take up the people first of India and then of China, making their cause her own, even to starvation, imprisonment, and imminence of death? How does she win their confidence so that they prefer her teaching to anything of their own? So that's an interesting passage. So, Sinclair is really exaggerating from what we're aware of from the historical record of Smedley's role in the Chinese Communist Army. She was not a leader. She was certainly not a leader of any celestial revolutionaries. Sinclair's really patronizing attitude towards the darker-skinned masses is very clear from his description. She's described, right, as a leader, a teacher, a martyr, a bearer of the white woman's burden. Sinclair doesn't answer the question that he poses of why Smedley finds other causes around the world more compelling than that of the American working man, that being somewhat an intentional choice of words. But he does find her international-minded sensibilities laudable, if perplexing. Her desire to risk all for the people of another country is what Sinclair uses to construct her as a messiah of the Chinese people. The thing about this that's even stranger to me is that in this essay, he then includes something that Smedley writes to him about how he has written about her. And she says this: I am really no leader in China, not at all. I am a writer of fact, a recorder of events, a chronicler of the Chinese Revolution, or try to be. Do not exaggerate my role or position. So Sinclair's use of a quote from Smedley bluntly contradicting his characterization of her actions is a very odd way to end this piece. He kind of goes on to try to spin this as, she's being very modest, but I would say, from Smedley's own account, it's fairly accurate. This is a sort of statement of I think, basically empirical fact as much as one can know these things. So given the sort of hyperbolic description that Sinclair gives of Smedley, right, he kind of, in other parts of the essay, likens her to Guy Fawkes and Joan of Arc. His inclusion of her denial may, be to indicate her heroic modesty. But he can't really resist the temptation of casting Smedley as the white heroine of the Chinese, whereas Smedley herself depicts herself as only a witness and a recorder of a movement, nothing more and nothing less. Sinclair also really can't resist writing himself into the drama of the Chinese communist struggle. And so he talks about another sort of act of translation, a sort of act of interpolation and a circulation of his work. Right? And so he talks about this moment where he says, she told me that my novel, she being Smedley, Love's Pilgrimage, was being translated by a young Chinese political who had been sentenced to prison for a long term. He has permitted no social or other literature. They have permitted him to have Love's Pilgrimage, thinking it was only a love story. So he's translating it in prison into the Chinese language. He sits in a cell, always chained. Later on, I learned that this young Chinese, Liu Qian or Jianju, did not live to finish his long task. He was shot. I hope this was not because the jailers had read his translation, which is an interesting way to make it all about you. Yeah. In this passage, Sinclair speculates that this, revolutionary had been executed because the guards had read his translation. He seems to overlook the fact that Liu was already in prison when he began his translation, and perhaps the charges that led him to be in prison might have been why he had been ultimately executed. So in this case, Sinclair, like Xiaohong, inserts a presence of an American book into a Chinese setting, although in this case, the book is his own work. Similar to the way that he positions Smedley and his own book as protagonists in these Chinese stories, Smedley leads Chinese armies, his book inspires political martyrdom. The Chinese masses and the Chinese translator are passive recipients of American action and literature. This moment of contact between Sinclair and Liu Qianju arises from the nationalist prison guards' misreading and misunderstanding of the title. Right, it's only a love story. Sinclair and Leo, the perceptive reader, know the truth. Right, Sinclair considers the possibility that Leo may have been shot not because he was a leftist prisoner in a nationalist prison, but because the prison guards may have read the translation and become more informed readers of Sinclair's work. So I'm going to turn now to another part of this story. And so Agnes Smedley and Xiaohong's relationship, although it's kind of briefly represented in their own writings, Agnes Smedley proves really instrumental in Xiaohong's contact and sort of with other American writers, as well as the circulation and translation of her work. And it is because of Smedley that we see the first American Anglophone translation of her work in 1941. So she is a connecting point between two really very different China hands. So I'll just go back really quick, I'm so sorry. So this is the person on the right, Helen Foster Snow. And I could be wrong about this, but I don't think that she is, a particularly well-known figure. She's probably best known for being the wife of Edgar Snow, who's a more famous person. But she was the co-translator of Xiaohong's first short story published in the United States. She was born in Utah and moved to Shanghai on her own in 1931, and she met and married Edgar Snow there, who was already by that point an established journalist. After their marriage, Helen Foster Snow began working on her own literary career as a journalist and as a translator, as well as an editor, actually. And so she became involved in student protests and covered them for a number of Anglophone papers in 1935. Although many of her Chinese friends were Communist Party members and sympathizers, Snow herself never professed any affinity for communism. Her belief seems to lie in American exceptionalism and the compatibility between Chinese culture and American Protestant values. It's sort of hard to say why she has not been as well known even as Agnes Smedley or her husband. One of the reasons that has been given for this by her biographer, Kellyanne Long, is because Helen Foster Snow wrote most of her work under a pseudonym, Nim Wales. And so one of the reasons that I think this, that she has hypothesized of why she's just not particularly well known is because she just writes under so many different names. And this may have been, in fact, to kind of protect her leftist sources when she was writing things, but it has kind of had this this kind of unfortunate consequence of obscuring her contribution and kind of muddying the waters. I will say one of her books has recently been reprinted by Kaya Press, and that was a biography or autobiography of a Korean revolutionary, but it's credited to the subject, not to her. So even today, I think that came out a few years ago. She still remains this very shadowy literary figure in many ways. So Snow traveled to Yan'an, arriving in 1937, shortly after Agnes Smedley, so becoming the second woman to reach Yan'an. And both women lived in the communist camp at the same time. For those of us nerds who follow these sorts of things, the gossip of this is that Snow and Smedley didn't get along, that they fought, that they didn't like each other. And I think that's probably true. I think from Helen Foster Snow's writing, it seems like that's certainly how she felt about it. That said, personally, I'm a little bit skeptical simply because they have this literary relationship that allows Xiaohong's work to be published. So even if they had this falling out in 1938, 1939, they're still communicating enough for Xiaohong's manuscript to travel between their hands in 1941. So I remain a little bit skeptical about this, but I'm happy to be proved wrong about that, I suppose. So Xiaohong's introduction through Agnes Smedley is not really an isolated occurrence. She's in fact Smedley is a key figure in a number of literary exchanges between the Chinese and American left. Obviously Richard So covers some of this in his first book. During the time that she made the introduction to between Xiao and Sinclair and Xiao and Snow, Smedley is working as a newspaper correspondent, and she's part of this really contentious group of American China hands, including Emily Hahn and John K. Fairbanks. So all of these connections would have really lasting impacts on the literary lives of all of them involved. And so I'm focused here on the English translation of Xiaohong's story, Ma Fang Zhi Ye. I won't talk about my analysis of that translation too much in the interests of time. I have a lot to say about it. If you are so unwise as to ask me about it, I will probably talk your ear off for several hours, so you are warned now. It is very interesting, and I would love to talk about it, but in the interest of kind of focusing on, I think, the more feminist aspects in this chapter, I haven't talked about that. But so she arranges for the English translation of Xiaohong's story, which is later published in the Pearl Buck-run Asia magazine. But she also gives a copy of Xiaohong's first novel, Field of Life and Death, Sheng Si Chang, to Upton Sinclair. So this is the gift that he mentions in that letter that I opened the presentation with. Unfortunately, Xiaohong never got to see this translation, and she died before she received the royalties from it. Helen Foster Snow and Smedley, might have been expected to be friends, but they did seem to have really different ideological positions. Smedley was a very proud socialist who really proclaimed her sympathies quite openly. And then later we discovered that she was part of the Richard Sorge spy ring for Russia. And so, while Snow was friends with Lu Xun and Hu Feng and people like that, including Mao Zedong and Zhu De, she really, kind of championed the superiority of liberal democracy. I don't think I included this in the slide, but I do want to read this sort of particular passage from her memoir, My China Years, because I just find it sort of an interesting jumping off point. So she says, the Chinese, in turn, and this is when she's in Yan'an, recognized that we Americans represented what was good and trusted us and liked us, while they hated Li De, who, that's the Chinese name of a German Comintern agent. This is part of the old continuing bond of Chinese-American friendship, which has never existed to anything like such an extent among any other nationalities. Agnes Smedley told me she thought Mao Zedong, sinister and feminine and hated him on sight. But I liked him and felt a rapport with him, as Edgar Snow, her husband at the time, had from the first. So this passage is really striking as an example of Snow's idea of an inherent affinity between the United States and China. Right? She describes, we Americans represented what was good. Her account really pointedly excludes her fellow American, Agnes Smedley. And sort of implies that Smedley doesn't count as an American because she does not like Mao. Snow really contrasts, her report of Smedley's reportedly negative impression of Mao with their instant affinity for him. And although they're sort of drawn together as these two American women in Yan'an, she records that they have really deep disagreements over their positions on marriage. Snow was pro, Smedley was kind of meh about that, and their attitudes on the Chinese women in the camp. That said, they remained on professional footing. So, Xiaohong's story, Ma Fang Zhiye, is published in 1941, and it had this really strong connection, as I said earlier, with these different American-China hands. We know very little about the process by which Snow and her collaborator, Jiao Wu, kind of had with translation. We know that Snow did not read Chinese. She preferred to kind of focus on her spoken ability. So this potentially kind of complicates the process. What we can uncover from this is that Snow leaves behind some fragmentary comments on their process in an unpublished manuscript called Unlacquered Tales from China. These comments appear in the manuscript but don't appear in the version published in Asia. And so she says, I edited the translation by Jia Wu, which was usually done verbally while I typed up the English on my typewriter. We discussed the English meanings as we went along, so I edited it, but did not do the translation from the Chinese print. So this seems consistent with what we know about her language ability. However, in the published edition, this published story in Asia credits Snow as one of the co-translators. So despite this kind of ambiguity, the final product really bears a very strong resemblance to the didactic and diagnostic tendency in her writing, which I would, again, be happy to bore you with later. But I'm going to focus particularly on the way that Helen Foster Snow introduced Xiaohong to an American audience. So there are a number of different kind of versions of biographical notes that she kind of used as sources to introduce Xiaohong to the readers of Asia magazine. So she says, I asked Xiaohong for some biographical information. And she includes what appears to be a translation of one of Xiaohong's autobiographical essays, which is 永久的憧憬和追求. And this is an essay, if you're not familiar with it, that is very much, I think, in line with the kind of authorial persona that Xiaohong has with Chinese readers. She's kind of tragic modern girl. She's kicked out by her oppressive family. She's kind of a melancholy wanderer. She has never returned home. It's like that kind of essay, right? The essay really kind of briefly recounts Xiaohong's troubled relationship with her father and her grandfather's attempts to protect her and their tenants from her father's abuse. So this essay is not really an author's biography in a conventional sense. And in any case, Snow really heavily draws upon in the published manuscript other sources to come up with a suitable author biography for Xiaohong. So she says, the following translation about Xiaohong, published in Beiping Xinbao, adds interesting information about her. So it's sort of telling that Snow prefers a third-hand account of Xiaohong's life to the author's own self-description. Not necessarily a bad thing, but the things that Snow includes in her description provide a really colorful, if somewhat factually inaccurate account of Xiaohong's marriage and subsequent divorce to a wealthy college student, which, as far as I'm aware, didn't happen. So she says, after her divorce, she led a romantic life, meanwhile, in the cosmopolitan city of Harbin, abandoning herself to revelry and disillusionment. She then arrived in the Eastern Hotel, utterly helpless, to begin her life anew. Compelled by poverty, she took to writing about her adventures. Her first writings were published under the pen name Qiaoyin in the Guoji Xiebao, a progressive Chinese newspaper in Harbin popular among local Chinese intellectuals. She spoke of things no other woman writer had had the daring to touch upon, which led to her acquaintance with Liu Sanling, which I think refers to Liu Sanlang, which is one of the many, many other aliases of Xiao Jun, who is her first partner, husband, something. Also known as the famous Chinese writer Tian Jun, which is another name by which Xiao Jun is known. He has a lot, who was then a homeless young writer. So unlike Xiaohong's own account of her life, this newspaper story characterizes the kind of tumultuous, characterizes her life in terms of tumultuous and scandalous detail. Generally speaking, Xiaohong's Chinese friends and colleagues tend to support a narrative similar to the one she provided to Snow, a sort of Nora-esque narrative of a young woman breaking away from a cruel and oppressive traditional family. Instead, Snow refracts Xiaohong for American readers in a markedly different way. So rather, her characterization places a much more sensational cast upon her life. Right? The use of the words abandon and revelry seem to highlight Xiaohong's more sexually decadent lifestyle. The sentence, she wrote of things no other woman writer had had the daring to touch upon. If you're familiar with her work, it's not particularly sexual, but it suggests this kind of idea of taboo or transgression, right? So the discrepancy between these two kind of one self-vision and another sort of fashioning of Xiaohong's persona is indicative of the way that Snow and Wu approaches her short story. And again, I'm happy to bore any of you about this later after I'm done talking. But by contrast, Smedley, who's an ardent communist, right, approached China through the lens of both class and gender. So instead, viewing Xiaohong and, by extension, most Chinese women as more advanced than their Western counterparts. Right? She believed that China could and should, Snow instead believed that China could and should be democratized, right? And she highlights this in her writing. In closing, translation played a really important part in Xiaohong's ability to read and know her American colleagues and vice versa. Right? The most important aspect came from the way that these translations are refracted and interpreted. The travel of authors and texts across the Pacific from 1920 until 1941 speak to the way that multiple authors have been refracted through a variety of different versions. In the case Of the refraction of Xiaohong, Upton, Sinclair, and Agnes Smedley, the result is not a unified image, but a series of mobile and sharply divergent ones. And most importantly, these refractions gesture towards a desire for legibility and portability across national boundaries. Reading these translations against each other reveal how these refractions interact, sometimes in complementary and sometimes in contradictory ways. Xiaohong draws certain lessons and resonances from Sinclair and Smedley's works and uses them in her own. While not explicitly creating transnational works, the act of reading allows her characters to recontextualize and clarify their own experiences. For Wang Yaming and Xiaohong herself, these readings allow them to focus and clarify their experiences in relation to their American counterparts. Their empathic responses are not only heightened, but they are able to see that their experiences have a lot in common with particularly working class characters in America. Upton Sinclair, on the other hand, uses the act of textual circulation and translation, I'm being somewhat uncharitable, I admit this, to aggrandize the power of his own work. And he really, seems to imagine America and American writers as the white saviors and enlighteners of the East. So Smedley, who's responsible for Xiaohong's manuscript reaching Snow, saw herself as an observer and recorder of China's struggle against colonialism and imperialism. Unlike Helen Foster Snow and Sinclair, she saw Chinese subjectivity as being distinct and often much more advanced than what she had seen. So Smedley resists this Sinclair's romanticization of her and suggests that China's own particular solutions to worldwide problems had much to teach her American readers. Okay. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for listening.
Okay, so we'll now open the floor to questions. And I just want to ask those of you who, actually, I might just go and sit next to Clara. And then I want to ask those of you who are asking questions to just kindly turn on your mic and speak to the mic so that, because we are videotaping this and uploading to our website for those of us who couldn't make it in person today. So I think we'll just start with I have questions, but I'll wait to hear from others. Thanks, Edna. Yes, Bea, please.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk, and you kept us awake and happy to listen to you, so I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed that. And I'm just very curious to know, how did you become interested actually in Xiaohong's story? How did you get to study this? Because I work in social sciences, so I'm always curious when people study literature or fields I'm not familiar with, to see how they come and choose their topics actually. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. I think in terms of this chapter, it really kind of came from following a footnote. I've always just enjoyed Xiaohong's writing, and I think for many of us, I assume, when you're trying to come up with a big, sort of book topic, you have to try to find something you really like because you're going to be sick of it anyway. So you may as well start out really passionate about it. I mean, I still really like her, actually. I really do. But eventually you will start to get sick of it. So it may as well be something that you're very interested in. And so it kind of came from, I think, following a footnote of, I was probably Howard Goldblatt at some point, just sort of saying, Upton Sinclair sent her a letter. And then I happened to be doing my doctoral research at HKU, and they have a collection of his sort of wartime newspaper, and I was like, I wonder if I could find that. And I could. So, that's sort of how I began thinking about it. And then once I started thinking about that, like a lot of archival research, you can kind of keep finding more things. So that led me to Helen Foster Snow. It led me to a number of other sort of topics. And then that sort of emerged more organically, I think, because they all sort of knew each other and they all kind of interacted. So that's sort of how I came to this topic.
Kim.
so much for your talk. I thought it was just so interesting how you describe this Transpacific relationship. All your examples just show how, when we think about Transpacific, leftist politics across, transnational borders, and how it's racially mediated, how it's emotionally inflected, there's all these sort of different things that are going on. So I thought that was so interesting. I studied actually Korea and proletarian literature in the 20s and 30s, and so I don't know much about Chinese proletarian literature. So, is Xiaolong, within the context of Chinese proletarian literature, is she known for that intersection of class and gender, or does the refraction through Smedley bring out that feminism? So the reason why I ask this question is because in Korean proletarian literature, it's not given, right? So often feminism was not it was subsumed under leftist politics, right? It was always secondary and not quite on the surface, right?
Right.
So can you just give me a little bit more context about that?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to face away from you like a weirdo and then okay. Sorry about that. It's not because I don't want to see you. But yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think in terms of how Xiaohong is, the interesting thing about how Xiaohong is remembered or how she's talked about is, despite I think being like a really good writer, she is more famous for her personal life. And I think that is unfortunately common for a lot of female writers. I just have read so many things of like, which of her husbands was the nicer one? And I'm like, I don't care. Like what? I mean, I guess I care a little, but I don't really care that much. But it's sort of had this unfortunate effect where we being kind of the field have tended to focus much more on the biographical. When she's been talked about, I think actually Gal, your advisor, Lydia Liu, has talked really famously about this, that her first novel has been kind of read in terms of gender as a kind of a really interesting and kind of early prescient illustration of the double burden of the working class woman. And it's a very sort of bleak novella that's sort of set during a period where Japan is invading Manchuria. But women in the story are subjected to kind of incredible sexual violence, both from the men in the village as well as Japanese soldiers. And that, this is a moment of critique, right? There's a very kind of chilling line at the end of the novella where this female character says, I hate the Japanese, but I hate the Chinese men too, right? Like there's that kind of articulation. But I would say like within other scholarship, and I think that's why that essay is so good, she tends to just be kind of folded into patriotic literature. And so I don't know if the gendered aspect of this has been brought up as much. I think one of the other things that has kind of gotten in the way with her is that a number of her other novels or works of writing have tended to be very heavily autobiographical. And so because of that, they are once again sort of folded into the sort of dark star of her biography, and it becomes more like, oh, this woman was so sad because this man was so mean to her. And so in that way, I think that her relationship to people like Smedley, or her relationship to people like a number of other writers that she was interacting with, she's also kind of in contact with this Japanese Esperanto teacher who married a Chinese man and was also there. Like there were a lot of other really interesting figures that she is in connection with and writes about and is kind of in community with, and yet none of that is ever talked about. And so one of the reasons that I was really interested in this in the chapter was like, how do I get out of talking about was Xiao Jun mean to her, was Duanmu Hongliang mean to her? And it wasn't that very sad. And it's like, yes, it was very sad. They were both not that nice. But if we want to talk about something that's more productive, I find this to be much more interesting. And there are ways in which it both kind of brings out this class consciousness that she has, as well as I think a real emphasis on her part of a kind of solidarity between women. So that's kind of my long answer to that. Thank you so much.
And also, just to, of course, her relationship with Lu Xun.
Yeah.
Right? So because Xiaohong was Lu Xun's protege, and Lu Xun was the towering figure in modern Chinese literature, he has discovered her when she was very young and has published her books. And for that reason, as Clara points out, she was co-opted either for her personal life or as a patriotic and Marxist writer with this ongoing. But I think what's so interesting in Clara's work is that while the chapter by Lydia Liu she mentioned has kind of redeemed Xiaohong's engagement and scathing critique of patriarchy, but still she's very much considered to be kind of a mainland canonical writer, appearing in these anthologies as a Chinese writer of the mainland. And really people don't know but just how transnational and transpacific her career was. So in that sense, it's absolutely fascinating. Yes, more questions. I can ask a question if while others think. I wanted to go back a little bit to that passage you close read from Hands, which I also teach in my gender class, and I love that story and I love that passage. And I think about it a lot, right? Like, what does it mean? Just what you pointed out, that there's the narrator who reads the story and is moved. And I love that you made this distinction between showing and telling, that the narrator tells us, I was so moved, but then Wang Yaming, the protagonist, who is almost illiterate, but, you know, and of working class background, she is actually moved. She's physically moved. But then that actually doesn't do anything for her, right? In the end of the day, she, at the end of the story, she has to drop out of school. She fails, she flunks out, and her dad doesn't have the money to continue paying. So she has to go back. They don't even have money for a horse to take their stuff to the train station, which is like 30 kilometers away. So they walk. And the girls at the school, because the story is told from the perspective of that upper class girl, watch her as she disappears into the background. And so I always thought about, like, what does it mean that there is this scene in the story where these two characters are reading a proletariat novel that is supposed to kind of fire up and mobilize people to change society. And they're both deeply moved by it, but nothing happens. Like, what does that mean as far as the writer's own reflection about the work of literature? In that she is writing that story too. About these characters. I was wondering if that's something you thought about. Do you see this moment as sort of like a metafictional moment, even in terms of how Xiaohong is thinking about foreign fiction, about kind of the sort of the global proletariat, because obviously that's what it is. She's citing that particular novel for a reason. But then how do we then square that with the fact that obviously this is a very sort of like Chinese realism story with all the poor characters die. So what do you think about, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I think, I'm not sure if this 100% answers your question, but this is what I kind of think about that. Like, you know, what does it do? And I also teach a story, but, you know, I think one of the questions that you have to ask yourself, right, and something that did sort of inform my analysis of this is, okay, like, they're both reading the same thing, who's the better reader, right? And we obviously know who the better reader is, right? We know who that is. And that's, you know, it's the working class person. And so, you know, I am not sure if I think that the fact that it doesn't do anything for her is the point, right? I think ultimately, there's something kind of problematic about this too, right? Like, ultimately the point is that we all know who the better reader is, right? We know that it's Yaming, it's not the narrator, right? But I think that's also one of the issues with the kind of proletarian fiction that is written from a middle class perspective. And not a problem, but it is like this, where it's like, no, this is for us to learn. You know, like I that's sort of how I feel about it. But, you know, I think that despite Xiaohong being kind of a downer as a writer, like I think those, you know, those kinds of moments are still not without value, right? Even if it doesn't work now, right? That connection is there, right? And kind of related to that, you know, when she's, you know, she continues to like come back to this beggar man, you know, and like she didn't do anything, you know, she didn't do anything, but it's like there was something there, right? Even if not, you know, even if there's no forward motion, there was a moment. And I often do think that Xiaohong is a writer of moments, right? Of these kind of like moments of resonance that don't necessarily have a kind of teleological revolutionary thrust to them, but like there is something there. That's sort of how I often feel about it.
Do you want to say a few words about, which I was interested in,
Yeah.
and you said you can talk about it,
Uh-huh.
about the story, the Mafanjie,
Oh, yeah.
and how
Yeah.
that sort of, because the letter, your reading of the letter
Yeah.
is incredibly interesting, because
Right.
it really does show what you call refractions,
Right.
in the book.
Right.
And the whole thrust of sort of opening, like undoing the Chinese canon,
Yeah.
and showing that it's not just about national
Right.
literature, as
Right.
we are all trained to think in this field.
Yeah.
So can you say a few words
Sure.
about that story and
Sure.
how that...
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I think, so the story, the original story is about an old man who, a sort of old working class man who is waiting for his childhood friend, who is also his landlord, to come and visit him. And while he is doing that, he is having a lot of thoughts, and kind of remembers that a bunch of his other working class friends went away to become bandits and then died young. And so that's kind of the thrust of the story. And like a lot of Xiaohong stories, it doesn't really, like nothing happens. It's like this old man, he's cold, he's in a stable, he has a lot of thoughts, and then that's the kind of the end, right? But so what happens with Helen Foster Snow is that Helen Foster Snow and Jia Wu, and again, like I'm not entirely sure whose contribution this was, they invent a new character. And they invent a new character whose name is Yang Lao San. And what's really interesting and translingual about that is that there is one of the characters that, one of the friends that he mentions in passing is named Yang Lao San. And that the translation, like the romanization would be Yang. But then they use it to be like, oh, there's this young man, and then there's an old man. And so it becomes this story of not like, oh yeah, I like had all these friends, like, and I mean, in the original, it's like, oh yeah, there was like Yang Lao San, and then there was like Xiao Wang, and then there was this other, you know, there are all these people, they're not characters. So then Yang Lao San becomes this idealistic man who is gallant and sort of knight-like and died for his beliefs, unlike this old man who compromised himself. And so instead of, I think, being a story of more like a mood and not, you know, some kind of like first A happens, then B happens, then C happens, it becomes a morality tale of the way to be, you know, the way forward for China is for it to like be young and like be, you know, idealistic and fight for what you believe in. And so that's a really big change, you know, to invent this new character, to give him this name. You know, they really created, I would say, like about 25% of a new story.
This is in 1941,
Yeah.
you said.
Yeah. So, I mean, you could do that. I mean, I guess you could still do that, but like, it's easier to do that and no one find out. Or, no, you know, it takes a lot longer for someone to find out. So, you know, I think they did do that. And then I relate that to one of the reasons why I kind of credit that a little more to Snow is because she has a tendency to do this in a lot of her other work. That she'll kind of talk about people like Mao Zedong as like King Arthur. So she'll say like, oh, Mao Zedong and the Yan'an communists are like King Arthur and his knights. And I mean, like, I don't want to just like laugh at her, right? That would be very mean-spirited of me, even though like sometimes I'm just kind of like, why would you do that? But because I think it was like a way that she was trying to kind of communicate this to an American audience, right? Her strategy very often was to say, oh, these Chinese people, they are just like these people whose story we already know, right? And so it becomes this kind of shorthand
just
to
like
do
us.
that. Kind of. I mean, both her and her husband were very much like, we don't want them to be strange, right? So that's the kind of translation strategy here. So I don't think that it was necessarily in a malicious way,
Right, yeah.
but like she tends to have these like ways in which she is very diagnostic. So she's like, okay, this is China, this is the problem, this is how we fix it, right? Like there's that kind of aspect. So it's like, okay, this old man, he has a problem, this is how he should have fixed it, right? That's often something that people who have looked at her work, myself included, have kind of noticed. She also does this with another, I can't remember his name. He's one of the CCP, he's a CCP officer, and she just calls him like the Red Robin Hood. So it's like this, again, this like kind of interesting mashup of like Red Riding Hood, Red for Communist, and then Robin Hood, rob the rich to give to the
Master of
poor.
the thieves,
Yeah, like all of this kind of interesting. So she's very interesting in that way. And so, that's kind of how I talk about that, yeah.
Does Pearl Buck feature into this at all, into this group, just out of curiosity?
Yes and no. Yeah, I mean, Pearl Buck is kind of behind a lot of this because she publishes Asia Magazine.
Right.
And I don't, I think there is often a tendency to read, and it's not undeserved, I think, to read the liberal Democrats, so like the Helen Foster Snow, Pearl Buck, Emily Hahn, like as the kind of, if you're a leftist, then they're the bad guys. Mm-hmm. If you're not a leftist, then I guess they're okay. And then, then Smedley, Edgar Snow, Anna Louise Strong, like as like the other, there's this kind of like sideism.
Right. Yeah, of China hands.
Yeah. And I see that and I get that, but I also find that a little problematic. And I do actually think that, this kind of collaboration between Smedley and Snow, who like, I don't think they were best friends, but they did work to, like Smedley's also like more connected to this than I think when we draw these sides that we give her credit for, so.
Rongdao,
Oh.
please. Oh, Rongdao and then Kim.
Thank you, Clara, for this really, really fascinating talk. Like during Q&A, sometimes you get really important theoretical, conceptual questions, right? And then sometimes you get people who are like so hung up on peculiar details. And just want you to talk about that. So I'm going to set a sample for the letter. Halfway through, you were talking about this prisoner who were like translating, after Hitler, and allegedly, was executed. Yeah. Because of the translation that he was doing. Yeah. I was wondering. So you said that he was Liu. Do we know anything more about him? Because I was just so curious.
Where is that?
About
Yeah. Where is that? Oh yeah, there it is.
Later, here.
Yeah, I did try to figure this out. The problem, I think, as many of us know, of Wade Giles is like if you drop the apostrophe, it can really be a lot of things, right? So I chose, I kind of said Liu Qianzhu, but it could be Liu Jian, like there's a lot of different ways that you could read that depending on if the publisher dropped that apostrophe in either case, right? So yeah, I don't know that much about him. I did try to find something out about him, but I don't know.
And I mean, you didn't even finish translating it.
No.
It's not even like you can follow the translation,
I can't.
publication, and how you...
And that was why I found it so fascinating.
Yeah.
This is like you have someone who was actually, allegedly
Right.
doing the translation.
Right.
And then, I mean, he was in jail, and, I mean, there must be
There might be a record of
a
that.
record.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, so anyway, speaking of a peculiar
No, it,
question, I was just,
Yeah.
I somehow was just, I couldn't stop thinking about that guy who's like chained, in the cell and still trying to
Translating
translate like love story.
yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, I do wonder about him too. But no, unfortunately, I don't have any other details about that. I'm so sorry.
Kim, you had a question,
I
right?
already asked one, so do you want to go first, Maria? I don't want to run.
Hey, my students are here. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, my students, as well.
Yay. So this is not my field, but thank you for giving such an illuminating conversation talk today. I just have a question about. So I'm trained in American Studies. We talked about this earlier, and what I'm getting from the lecture is this is a story about Transpacific. But I was fascinated by Smedley's, kind of like sort of like circuit. Like they went to India, she went to India, and then there was a mention earlier of Japan. So I was thinking but the story that you presented seems to be like a story between China and the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And how that kind of framing. Then I wonder if you could kind of. Is that how we understand Transpacific, kind of like a canon? Is there a way for us to travel that in how we understand these circuits of translation? And this is kind of like from someone who's totally outside of this field.
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. Thank you so much for that. I think, I mean, in this particular instance, and there are other parts in the book where I think I do like China, Japan, Indonesia, Singapore, like that kind of thing, right? So I think I agree. I think that one of the ways that Transpacific sometimes I think can be used to just be like like Asian and the US particularly, or sometimes if we're being very expansive and being slightly sarcastic, like, Asia and Canada, like it tends to be like, okay, you have to have one in this hemisphere, and then you have to have one in this hemisphere. And I agree with you that I don't think that that's really, like, having read some of the theories, like I don't think that that's really what they are saying. And that one of the things that I really like about the Transpacific is that it is flexible, right? That we can talk about, kind of the idea of sub-empire, or we can talk about kind of like inter-Asian circulation, or the way that there are kind of, circuits that have been worn within Asia. So yes, in this particular case, it is, I think, it is that kind of way that it's like, okay, we take one from category A and we take one from category B, and that's what Transpacific is. But in other aspects of the book, and I think, in other work that I really admire, there's a lot more that we can do to kind of trouble these issues. And yeah, I think like if I was considering Smedley on her own terms, right? She is embedded in a lot of other kind of contexts, in Indian independence and a number of other issues. So
And eugenics.
Yeah, that also too. That also too. But and even like Xiaohong also, like, one of the things that I think when I was first thinking through this project, I said to my advisor, was like, oh yeah, I guess Xiaohong didn't really go anywhere outside China. And she's like, what are you talking about? Like, what is Hong Kong? Like, what is Hong Kong? And it's like, oh, right. So I think there are also ways in which we can look at the ways that borders have shifted and things like that. But yeah, like absolutely, in other parts of the book, I do use Transpacific in other ways. I did read a review of this book where they said that chapter where I don't talk about the U.S. is not Transpacific, and I think I disagree with that person's understanding of the term, because I do think like one of the real benefits of that versus like Asian/American or transnational, right, is this kind of idea that Asia can, there are flows and there are different hierarchies and there are other things, right, and that the U.S. and Canada and like Latin America can be involved in this, right, but that there's a lot of fluidity there. So yeah, I absolutely take that point, right, that there are a lot of ways that we could do that, even though in this particular case, I don't do that.
Well, I had actually a very similar question. I guess maybe it's just a little bit, I guess, slanted in a different direction, but it also had to do with my first question. So within the Transpacific relationship, so this relationship with your example is between U.S. and China, and I haven't read your entire book, so I don't know whether you talk about this in other chapters, but is something opened up? Can you only rethink the canon through the eyes of these U.S. Writers? Is it so oftentimes you think about, okay, the U.S. vision, the U.S. writer vision of these Chinese scholars is orientalized, and we've heard that kind of discussion. But I think you're pointing to something different, in that you're saying that there are, and that's why I mentioned the feminism aspect.
Right.
Is the feminism of that writer opened up within that relationship, and that's what is, and that's how we could rethink the modern canon apart from how it's canonized within that kind of national conversation, right?
Yeah.
So I was just curious as to how you figure the Transpacific.
Right.
Yeah.
You should mention also with that paper you gave on Xiaohong and friendship with the Russian.
Oh, yeah.
She was transnational, regional in that sense too.
Yeah, no, that's thank you for that. Thank you for that. No, that's it's a really good question, and I think I can definitely talk to you about the other article that I wrote about this, but that is, I think, a bit more feminist. It's another kind of, I look at a couple of other, Xiaohong's other pieces that talk about her relationship with a Russian, or sort of friendship with a Russian Jew, and then a Korean woman also, and kind of talk about those. But in terms of the book, and in terms of what we get out of this, are we looking at this through do we need a kind of outside perspective to kind of unlock some of this? I think my answer overall is no. I think this is why I was quite attracted to the idea of refraction and the kind of translation as refraction. And this idea that, refraction can be a kind of rewriting, it can be mistakes, it can be something new. And so I guess when I was first writing this book, I had a really excellent comment, and it was a really good comment in that it made me think about a lot of things, and I had a very strong reaction. So someone was like, okay, so you have some bad guys and you have some good guys. It's very clear. I think sometimes I still have a little bit of this, but I really don't want to have it, right? Where it's okay, Snow's the bad guy because she made a new character, right? Because she's supposed to be loyal to the original, right? Spendley's the good guy because she doesn't really do that, right? Upton Sinclair's being kind of racist. I think I'm comfortable with saying that, and I'm okay with that. But I guess one of the things that I wanted to, the reason that I'm saying that is they have lives beyond their own, they have lives beyond the original. That is not to say that we have to look at it through this outside perspective, but that they can kind of exist. They can exist alongside each other. They don't all have to be the same. They don't all have to be accurate, right? There is a value in that Snow translation. There is a value in the way that Xiaohong relates to Agnes Smedley, even though she uses this as a vehicle to talk about herself. In that way, I love her very much. She's very self-centered, right? It's always about, okay, but what is my experience? And I think that there can be value in that, right? But there are ways of interpreting it. There are some other parts of the book where I think the Laoshe chapter where in fact, this is a book, that chapter is about, so Laoshe wrote a novel in Chinese, translated it into in English in the United States, then went home to China, and then was persecuted in the Cultural Revolution, and the manuscript was lost. So the extant translation, the extant version is the English translation, which was then translated back into Chinese, and is different. Someone had to recreate that, and they made some changes. So there are other parts of the book where I actually don't do the the sort of impact response thing of the West has this kind of, we have to kind of see it through that. So there are ways in which I think that's talking back. In terms of the feminism aspect, I think within Xiaohong's work and in that article that I wrote, she is, I think, really interested in a kind of transnational sympathy, this particularly among women, and that she has this moment with this Korean woman who, for a very long time, they're roommates, but she doesn't know that she's Korean. She just knows that there's something weird going on. And she's like, no, we just talked about being women. And then when this woman moves out of their apartment, then she's like, oh, and then I found out that actually they had been exiled because they had been independents, anti-colonial people. There's a sort of similar thing with the Russian Jew that she's also friends with that is sort of interesting because it's sort of being this idea of homelessness and exile. I think because it's being written when she's in Shanghai and she can't go home, is a sort of
she's from Manchuria.
She's from Manchuria. She's after the Japanese colonized Manchuria, then she comes to Shanghai and basically feels like she cannot return. Japanese nationalists being generally not fond of communists in general, right? So that she is kind of reading that back onto her own experience as well. So I think there's a lot of kind of productive things with her in relation to that aspect. But I do think for her, gender and feminism particularly is this refraction point. She seems much more willing to kind of acknowledge those possibilities within the female experience. So.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? Okay, otherwise we're right on time for wrapping up. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. Do follow us next year. We will be sending emails as well, but our website will be active and will announce all of our forthcoming talks, several of which will take place in the fall. Thank you so much and have a great summer.